Era Martinez had always been different. Growing up in a small Texas town where football was religion and tradition ruled everything, she stood out like a wildflower in concrete. While other girls her age were learning to braid each other's hair and gossiping about boys, Sarah was climbing the tallest trees in her backyard and challenging the neighborhood kids to arm wrestling matches she almost always won. Her father, Miguel Martinez, was a mechanic who worked with his hands and believed in hard work above all else. Her mother, Linda, was a nurse who had seen enough pain and suffering to understand that life wasn't always fair, but that didn't mean you had to lie down and accept it. Together, they raised Sarah with a simple philosophy. When life knocks you down, you get back up stronger than before. Sarah's childhood was filled with scraped knees, torn jeans, and adventures that would have made most parents gray with worry. She wasn't reckless, but she was fearless. There's a difference, though most people couldn't see it. When she was 8, she rescued a neighbor's cat from a drainage pipe during a thunderstorm. When she was 12, she stood up to a group of high school bullies who were picking on a younger kid at the bus stop. By the time she was 16, everyone in town knew Sarah Martinez as the girl who never backed down from anything. The military had never been part of her family's tradition. The Martinez family tree was full of teachers, mechanics, nurses, and small business owners. But Sarah felt a calling that went beyond the boundaries of her small town. She wanted to serve something bigger than herself, to test her limits against the most challenging circumstances possible. When she announced at her high school graduation party that she was enlisting in the Navy, the room went quiet for exactly 3 seconds before her father raised his beer and said, "Then, you better be the best damn sailor they've ever seen." Boot camp was everything Sarah had expected, and nothing like she had prepared for. The physical challenges were demanding, but manageable. She had been running 5 miles every morning since she was 14, and could do more push-ups than most of the boys in her graduating class. But the mental pressure, the constant breaking down, and building back up, the way they stripped away everything you thought you knew about yourself, that was something entirely different. Sarah thrived in that environment. While other recruits crumbled under the pressure or lashed out in frustration, she absorbed everything like a sponge. She learned to move quietly, think quickly, and never show weakness even when she felt like her body might give out. More importantly, she learned that the strongest weapon any soldier possessed wasn't their rifle or their training, it was their mind. After boot camp, Sarah specialized in intelligence gathering. She had a natural talent for languages and could pick up accents so perfectly that within weeks of studying a new dialect, she could pass for a native speaker. Her instructors noticed her abilities quickly. She wasn't just good at memorizing information. She could analyze patterns, read people's body language, and extract information from situations where others saw nothing useful. The Navy SEALs had only recently begun allowing women to attempt their training program. It was controversial, political, and intensely scrutinized by media and military leadership alike. When Sarah's commanding officer suggested she consider applying, her first instinct was to laugh. Not because she didn't think she could do it, but because she had never imagined they would want someone like her. The training was legendary for breaking people. 90% of candidates dropped out or were eliminated. The physical requirements were brutal, but the psychological warfare was what separated the SEALs from every other military unit. They didn't just want soldiers. They wanted people who could function under impossible pressure, who could think clearly when their world was falling apart, who could endure anything and come out the other side ready to complete their mission. Sarah made it through Hell Week on her second attempt. The first time, she had focused too much on proving she belonged there. The second time, she focused on proving it to herself. She carried boat hulls until her shoulders screamed. She crawled through mud under barbed wire until her elbows were raw. She held her breath underwater until spots danced in her vision. And through it all, she kept moving forward. The instructors tried to break her in every way they could think of. They questioned her motivation, her abilities, her right to be there. They put her through scenarios designed to make her quit. They told her she was holding back her teammates, that she was a liability, that she would get good people killed. Sarah listened to every word and used their doubt as fuel to push harder. When she finally earned her Trident pin, Sarah Martinez became one of only 3 women to successfully complete Navy SEAL training. The achievement made national news, but Sarah was already focused on what came next. She wasn't interested in being a symbol or a poster child for women in combat. She wanted to be the best operator she could be, regardless of gender, politics, or public opinion. Her first deployment took her to the Middle East, where she spent 6 months conducting reconnaissance missions in some of the most dangerous territory in the world. Sarah's language skills and ability to blend in made her invaluable for intelligence gathering. She could walk through a crowded marketplace and pick up conversations that provided crucial information about enemy movements. She could observe a building for hours and notice patterns that others missed. But it was her mental toughness that really set her apart. During one mission, Sarah and her team were pinned down by enemy fire for 14 hours. They couldn't move, couldn't call for backup, and couldn't retreat. While bullets flew overhead and the temperature climbed past 110 degrees, Sarah remained perfectly calm. She monitored radio chatter, tracked enemy positions, and kept her teammates focused on survival rather than panic. Her second deployment was to Southeast Asia, where she worked with local forces to disrupt human trafficking networks. The work was emotionally draining in ways that combat never was. Sarah saw things that haunted her dreams, met victims whose stories broke her heart, and learned that some forms of evil were far more personal and devastating than anything she had encountered in traditional warfare. It was during this deployment that Sarah first encountered the organization that would later change her life forever. They called themselves the Liberation Front, and they claimed to be fighting against government corruption and corporate exploitation. Their methods were questionable, but their intelligence network was extensive and sophisticated. Sarah's team was tasked with gathering information about the Liberation Front's activities in the region. What they discovered was more complex than anyone had anticipated. The group was involved in everything from arms smuggling to cyber warfare, but they also operated legitimate humanitarian programs that actually helped local communities. It was impossible to classify them as simply good or evil. They were something more complicated. During her investigation, Sarah made contact with several Liberation Front operatives. She posed as a freelance journalist interested in documenting their humanitarian work. The cover story allowed her to move freely in areas where a military presence would have been noticed immediately. She spent weeks building relationships, earning trust, and slowly gathering the information her superiors needed. One of her contacts was a woman named Elena Vasquez, who served as a regional coordinator for the Liberation Front's medical aid programs. Elena was intelligent, passionate, and genuinely committed to helping people who had been forgotten by their own governments. She was also extremely suspicious of outsiders and had survived in a dangerous world by trusting her instincts about people. Over the course of several meetings, Sarah and Elena developed what felt like a genuine friendship. They talked about books, shared stories about their childhoods, and found they had more in common than either had expected. Elena had grown up poor in Colombia and had seen her family destroyed by violence and corruption. Sarah found herself genuinely caring about Elena's work and the people she was trying to help. But Sarah's mission was clear, and she never forgot why she was there. She carefully documented everything she learned about the Liberation Front structure, funding sources, and operational methods. She identified key leadership figures, mapped their communication networks, and gathered evidence of their illegal activities. It was exactly the kind of intelligence work she had trained for, but it felt different when she was doing it to people she had come to respect. The mission was supposed to last 3 months, but Sarah's success in building relationships with Liberation Front members led to an extension. Her superiors wanted more detailed information about the group's international connections and future plans. Sarah agreed to stay, partly because she felt she was close to uncovering something significant, and partly because she had become genuinely invested in understanding the Liberation Front's complicated moral universe. That decision would prove to be the most consequential mistake of her life. Sarah had been in country for 5 months when she received intelligence that the Liberation Front was planning something major. Her contacts had become more secretive, more careful about what they shared with her. Elena had started asking pointed questions about Sarah's background and her real reasons for being in the region. The trust Sarah had worked so hard to build was starting to fracture. She should have extracted herself immediately. Every instinct she had developed through years of training was telling her the situation was becoming dangerous. But Sarah had never been someone who walked away from a challenge, and she felt she was close to uncovering information that could save lives and prevent a significant terrorist attack. The tip came from an unexpected source, a street vendor who had noticed unusual activity around one of the Liberation Front's safe houses. Sarah decided to investigate personally rather than waiting for backup. She told herself she was just conducting reconnaissance, that she would observe from a distance and report back to her team. But as she approached the building, she realized something was very wrong. The safe house was too quiet. The usual guards weren't at their posts. The windows that should have shown signs of life were dark. Sarah's training screamed at her to retreat, but she had committed to the mission and she wasn't going to turn back without concrete information. She circled the building twice, looking for any sign of activity. Everything appeared normal from the outside, but her instincts were telling her she was walking into a trap. Sarah had learned to trust those instincts. They had kept her alive through dozens of dangerous missions. But this time, her commitment to the mission overruled her survival instincts. She approached the building from the rear, where a service entrance provided the best opportunity for covert entry. The door was unlocked, which should have been another warning sign. Sarah drew her sidearm and moved carefully through the corridors, checking each room methodically. The building appeared to be empty. She was in what looked like an office when she heard the footsteps behind her. Sarah spun around to find Elena Vasquez standing in the doorway, flanked by two armed men. Elena's expression was cold, disappointed, and somehow sad. "We've known who you really are for weeks," Elena said quietly. "Did you think we were idiots? Did you think your cover story would fool people who have survived by being suspicious of everyone?" Sarah kept her weapon raised but made no aggressive moves. "Elena, I can explain. You're a Navy SEAL," Elena interrupted. "Sarah Martinez, age 27, from Texas. You've been gathering intelligence about our organization for the past 5 months. You've been very thorough, very professional, and very naive if you thought we wouldn't figure it out." The two armed men moved closer, and Sarah realized she was in the room they brought Sarah to was designed for one purpose: breaking people. It was small, windowless, and painted an institutional gray that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. A single chair sat in the center, bolted to the concrete floor. The walls were bare except for water stains that suggested the room had seen flooding, intentional or otherwise. The smell of disinfectant couldn't quite mask the underlying odors of fear and suffering that seemed to have seeped into the concrete itself. They secured Sarah to the chair with restraints that were professional grade, not rope or handcuffs, but specialized equipment designed to hold someone without causing permanent damage while still ensuring complete immobilization. Her feet were shackled to the chair legs, her hands bound behind her back with plastic zip ties that bit into her wrists if she tried to move them. Elena entered the room with two men Sarah hadn't seen before. One was tall and thin with the kind of pale complexion that suggested he spent most of his time indoors. The other was shorter, more muscular, with scarred hands and eyes that never seemed to blink. Elena looked uncomfortable in a way that gave Sarah hope. If Elena was uncomfortable, it meant she still saw Sarah as a person rather than just a target. "Let me explain how this is going to work," Elena said, pulling up a second chair and sitting directly across from Sarah. "We need information, and we're going to get it. The question is whether you make this easy for everyone or whether you force us to use methods that none of us will enjoy." Sarah met Elena's gaze directly. "What exactly do you want to know?" "Everything," the tall man said, speaking for the first time. His accent was hard to place, Eastern European, maybe Russian. "We want to know about your mission parameters, your chain of command, your communication protocols, and, most importantly, what your government is planning to do with the intelligence you've gathered about our organization." Sarah had trained for this scenario hundreds of times. Every military operative learns what to do if captured by hostile forces. The basic principles are simple. Reveal only your name, rank, and serial number. Don't give them anything they can use against you or your unit. Hold out as long as possible to give your team time to extract you or complete the mission. But the reality of being captured is never as clean as the training scenarios. Sarah wasn't dealing with a foreign military that might respect Geneva Convention protocols. She was in the hands of people who operated outside any legal framework, who had already demonstrated they were willing to cross lines that official military units wouldn't cross. "My name is Sarah Martinez," she said. "I'm a petty officer first class in the United States Navy. My service number is—" The shorter man moved so quickly that Sarah didn't see the blow coming. His open palm struck her across the face with enough force to make her ears ring. The sound echoed in the small room like a gunshot. "We already know who you are," he said in accented English. "We know your rank, your service number, and probably more about your background than you remember yourself. We're not asking for basic identification. We're asking for operational intelligence." Sarah tasted blood where her teeth had cut the inside of her cheek. She forced herself to remain calm, to think clearly despite the shock and pain. These people were professionals. They weren't going to make obvious mistakes or give her obvious opportunities to escape. They had planned this carefully, and they were prepared for a long process. "I can't tell you what you want to know," she said. "You understand that." Elena leaned forward in her chair. "Sarah, please think about this carefully. We're not asking you to betray your country or reveal state secrets. We just want to understand what threat we're facing so we can protect ourselves and our work. You've seen what we do, the medical clinics, the schools, the infrastructure projects. We help people who have been abandoned by their own governments. Don't you think we have a right to defend that?" It was a good argument, and Sarah could see the sincerity in Elena's eyes. But she also knew that the Liberation Front's humanitarian work was only part of their operations. The intelligence she had gathered showed they were also involved in arms trafficking, money laundering, and terrorist activities that had resulted in civilian casualties. Elena might genuinely believe they were the good guys, but that didn't make it true. "I understand your position," Sarah said, "but I have my own obligations." The tall man nodded to his partner, who moved to a cabinet Sarah hadn't noticed before. When he opened it, she could see an array of tools and devices that made her stomach tighten. Some she recognized from her own training in interrogation resistance. Others were unfamiliar, which somehow made them more frightening. "Let me tell you what we know about Navy SEAL training," the tall man said, selecting a small electronic device from the cabinet. "You've been conditioned to resist interrogation through a combination of physical and psychological techniques. You've practiced scenarios where you're subjected to stress positions, sleep deprivation, temperature manipulation, and controlled violence. You think you know what you can endure." He held up the device, which looked like a small remote control. "But your training was limited by legal and ethical constraints. Your instructors couldn't actually torture you. They could only simulate it. We don't have those limitations." Sarah felt her heart rate increase, but forced herself to remain outwardly calm. Fear was natural, even useful if properly controlled. But panic would cloud her judgment and make everything worse. She focused on her breathing, on staying present in the moment rather than imagining what might happen next. The device in the tall man's hand was an electrical stimulator, designed to deliver precisely controlled shocks. It was the kind of tool that could cause excruciating pain without leaving permanent marks or causing lasting damage. Sarah had heard about such devices but had never been subjected to them. "We're going to start simply," Elena said. "Tell us about your mission timeline. When did you first make contact with our organization? Who gave you the assignment? What were your initial objectives?" Sarah remained silent. The tall man pressed a button on the device, and electricity coursed through electrodes that had been attached to her wrists while she was unconscious. The pain was unlike anything she had experienced, sharp, intense, and completely consuming. Every muscle in her body contracted involuntarily, and she bit down hard to keep from crying out. The shock lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. When it stopped, Sarah was gasping and shaking. The tall man smiled coldly. "That was level 2 out of 10, he said. "We can do this for hours without causing permanent damage. The question is whether you want us to." Sarah forced herself to look directly at Elena. "You said you understood my position," she said through gritted teeth. "Then, you understand why I can't answer your questions." Elena's expression tightened. "I'm trying to help you avoid unnecessary suffering. We're going to get the information we need eventually. That's not in question. The only variable is how much pain you experience in the process." The next shock lasted longer, and was noticeably more intense. Sarah's vision blurred, and her body convulsed against the restraints. She could feel herself losing control of some bodily functions, which was both humiliating and terrifying. But she also noticed something else. Her mind remained clear. The pain was overwhelming, but it didn't cloud her thinking the way she had expected it might. "Let's try again," the tall man said. "Tell us about your extraction plan. How are you supposed to get out of the country? What's your emergency protocol if communication is lost with your handlers?" Sarah said nothing. The third shock was strong enough to make her bite her tongue, and she tasted fresh blood. But she also realized that she was already adapting to the experience. Her body was learning to cope with the electrical stimulation, and her mind was finding ways to distance itself from the immediate physical experience. This continued for what felt like hours. The questions became more specific, more targeted. They asked about her team's capabilities, their equipment, their communication methods. They wanted to know about planned operations, intelligence assessments, and strategic objectives. Sarah gave them nothing. The tall man grew increasingly frustrated with her resistance. He turned up the intensity of the shocks and began combining them with other stress techniques. They forced her to maintain uncomfortable positions for long periods. They played loud, discordant music that made concentration nearly impossible. They flashed bright lights in her eyes until her head pounded with pain. But through it all, Sarah held on to something that her captors didn't understand and couldn't touch: her sense of purpose. She wasn't enduring this torture for abstract concepts like patriotism or duty. She was protecting specific people, her teammates, her contacts, the civilians who would be endangered if operational intelligence fell into the wrong hands. Elena seemed to recognize that the physical approach wasn't working. During one of their breaks, she dismissed the two men and sat alone with Sarah in the gray room. "This doesn't have to continue," Elena said quietly. "I can see that you're strong enough to resist conventional interrogation methods. But we have other approaches." Sarah looked at her through swollen eyes. The electrical shocks had caused muscle spasms that left her face bruised and her body aching. "What are you saying?" "We know about your family," Elena replied. "Your parents in Texas. Your younger brother, who just started college. They're not involved in any of this, but that doesn't mean they're safe." The threat hit Sarah harder than any physical torture could have. Her family had no idea what she really did for the military. As far as they knew, she was stationed overseas doing routine intelligence work. They couldn't protect themselves against the kind of people who had captured her. "You touch my family, and I'll kill you," Sarah said with quiet intensity. "I'll find a way, no matter what happens to me. I'll make sure you pay for it." Elena met her gaze. "I believe you, which is why I hope it won't be necessary. Just give us something we can work with. You don't have to reveal operational secrets. Just confirm some of what we already know. Help us understand what kind of threat we're facing." Sarah realized that Elena was offering her a way out that preserved some dignity while potentially protecting her family. It was tempting, especially after hours of torture that had left her physically and emotionally drained. But she also knew it was a trap. Once she started providing any information, the questioning would escalate. They would want more details, more confirmation, more intelligence. There was no such thing as giving them just a little information. "I can't," Sarah said simply. Elena stared at her for a long moment, then stood up and walked to the door. "Then, we'll try a different approach," she said before leaving. When the door closed, Sarah was left alone in the gray room for the first time since her capture. She used the solitude to assess her situation honestly. Her body was battered but functional. Her mind was clear despite the stress and exhaustion. Most importantly, she hadn't broken. They had subjected her to significant torture and gotten nothing useful in return. But Sarah also knew this was just the beginning. Elena had hinted at other approaches, and the threat against her family suggested they were prepared to escalate far beyond physical torture. She needed to prepare herself mentally for whatever came next. She thought about her SEAL training, particularly the lessons about surviving as a prisoner of war. The instructors had emphasized that torture wasn't really about extracting information. It was about breaking the subject's will to resist. Physical pain was just one tool among many. Psychological manipulation, isolation, humiliation, and threats against loved ones were often more effective than any amount of physical suffering. Sarah closed her eyes and focused on the mental exercises she had learned for dealing with extreme stress. She visualized herself in peaceful settings, hiking in the mountains near her childhood home, swimming in the clear waters of a Texas lake, sitting on her parents' back porch watching the sunset. These images weren't escapism. They were anchors that helped her maintain her sense of self when everything else was under attack. She also thought about her mission and the people she was protecting. Somewhere, her teammates were probably planning a rescue operation. Her superiors would be analyzing the intelligence she had already provided and working to prevent whatever the Liberation Front was planning. Her sacrifice was buying time for all of those efforts to succeed. The door opened and Elena returned with a new person, a woman Sarah hadn't seen before. She was middle-aged, professionally dressed, and carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to authority. She looked more like a college professor than a terrorist. "My name is Dr. Carmen Rodriguez," the woman said, settling into the chair across from Sarah. "I'm a psychologist who specializes in stress response and behavioral modification. Elena asked me to speak with you because she believes you're a reasonable person who might respond better to a more analytical approach." Sarah remained silent, but she was immediately on guard. Physical torture was straightforward. You endured it or you didn't. Psychological manipulation was more subtle and potentially more dangerous. "I've been studying your responses to the questioning process," Dr. Rodriguez continued. "You have remarkable self-control and an unusually high pain tolerance. But more interesting is your cognitive resilience. Most people become confused or disoriented under this kind of stress. You seem to maintain perfect mental clarity. That suggests you've experienced similar trauma before." Sarah said nothing, but she was disturbed by the accuracy of the assessment. Dr. Rodriguez was right. Sarah's childhood had included experiences that prepared her for this in ways that normal military training never could have. But how could this woman know that? "I'm curious about your motivation," Dr. Rodriguez said. "Most people resist interrogation because they're afraid of the consequences of revealing information. But your resistance feels different, more personal. It's as if you're protecting something specific rather than following abstract principles." The observation was uncomfortably accurate. Sarah had been trained to resist revealing operational intelligence, but her deepest motivation was indeed more personal. She was protecting her teammates and her mission, but she was also proving to herself that she couldn't be broken, that she was worthy of the trust that had been placed in her. "Everyone breaks eventually," Dr. Rodriguez said gently. "It's not a moral failing or a sign of weakness. It's simple psychology. The human mind can only withstand so much stress before it begins to protect itself by giving the torturers what they want. The only question is what it takes to reach that breaking point." She leaned forward slightly. "For you, I suspect it won't be pain. You've already demonstrated you can absorb more physical punishment than most people can imagine. And threats against your family, while effective for many subjects, seem to only strengthen your resolve." Sarah felt a chill of fear. If physical torture and threats wouldn't break her, what did this woman think would? "But everyone has something they can't bear to lose," Dr. Rodriguez continued. "Something so fundamental to their identity that losing it would be worse than death. For most Navy SEALs, that something is their sense of honor and competence. They can't stand the idea that they might fail their mission or let down their teammates." She pulled out a tablet and showed Sarah a series of photographs. They showed the aftermath of what looked like a terrorist attack: bodies in the street, destroyed buildings, emergency responders pulling victims from rubble. "This happened 3 days ago in the Capitol." Dr. Rodriguez said her 72nd hour was when Sarah realized they had made a fundamental mistake about who she really was. Not the mistake of underestimating her pain tolerance or her training. They had adapted their methods as they learned those lessons. Their mistake was deeper, more basic. They thought she was trying to protect information when she was actually protecting herself. Dr. Rodriguez had spent the past day implementing what she called cognitive dissonance therapy. It was a sophisticated form of psychological torture that involved creating contradictions between Sarah's beliefs and apparent reality. They showed her fabricated evidence that her teammates had abandoned her, that her mission had been compromised from the beginning, that everything she thought she knew about her assignment was a lie. The approach might have worked on someone whose identity was built on external validation or institutional loyalty. But Sarah's sense of self came from deeper sources. She had learned self-reliance in a childhood that required her to be her own protection. Her parents had loved her, but they couldn't shield her from every challenge or fight every battle for her. Sarah had built her identity around being someone who could stand alone when necessary. Elena entered the gray room for what Sarah sensed would be their final conversation. She looked tired, frustrated, and somehow diminished by the process she had been overseeing. Sarah wondered if Elena had ever been through anything like this herself, or if she was learning what torture actually looked like when applied to someone who wouldn't break. 72 hours, Elena said, sitting heavily in the chair across from Sarah. That's how long you've been here. Do you know what the average breaking point is for trained military personnel? 8 to 12 hours. For special operations forces, it's usually 18 to 24 hours. Elite units like the SEALs sometimes last 36 hours before they provide some form of cooperation. Sarah met her gaze, but said nothing. Her body was a catalog of pain from 3 days of systematic torture. Electric shocks had left burn marks on her wrists. Stress positions had torn muscles in her back and shoulders. Sleep deprivation had made her vision blur and her hands shake. But her mind remained clear, focused, and absolutely committed to giving them nothing useful. 72 hours without a single piece of actionable intelligence. Elena continued. Dr. Rodriguez says you're displaying psychological patterns she's never seen before. Complete resistance without apparent emotional cost. No signs of breaking, no cracks in your resolve, no indication that continued pressure will be effective. Elena leaned forward. She thinks you might actually be incapable of breaking, not because of your training or your willpower, but because of something fundamental about how your mind works. She says trying to break you psychologically is like trying to melt a diamond with a blowtorch. Sarah finally spoke. What does that mean for me? It means we've learned something valuable about Navy SEAL training methods, Elena replied. And it means we're going to have to make some difficult decisions about what happens next. The tall man entered the room, followed by Dr. Rodriguez, and 2 guards Sarah hadn't seen before. The group was larger than any that had questioned her previously, which suggested something significant was about to happen. We've reached an impasse, Dr. Rodriguez announced. Further interrogation would be pointless. This subject has demonstrated complete resistance to every technique in our arsenal. Continuing would be a waste of resources. Sarah felt a complex mixture of pride and fear. She had achieved something that apparently impressed even her torturers, but that didn't necessarily improve her situation. People who couldn't be broken were often seen as too dangerous to release. However, Dr. Rodriguez continued, this experience has provided us with valuable intelligence about current Navy SEAL conditioning methods. The level of psychological resilience we've observed suggests significant advances in their training protocols. This information will be useful for future operations. Elena stood and walked to where Sarah was restrained. I want you to know that I respect what you've accomplished here. You've endured things that would have broken almost anyone else. You've protected your mission and your teammates. You've proven yourself to be exactly what you claim to be. She paused, then continued. But respect doesn't change our situation. You know too much about our organization to be released. And keeping you prisoner indefinitely would be both expensive and risky. Sarah understood what Elena was telling her. They were planning to kill her. She had survived 72 hours of torture only to face execution because she had been too successful in resisting them. There is another option, the tall man said. We could arrange for your escape. Sarah looked at him suspiciously. What do you mean? We could stage a rescue scenario that would allow you to return to your unit with your cover story intact. You would report that you were captured, tortured, and escaped. Your superiors would consider you a hero who successfully resisted interrogation under extreme circumstances. Elena picked up the explanation. In exchange, you would provide us with specific, limited intelligence that would help us avoid future conflicts with your government. Not operational secrets, just enough information to prevent the kind of tragic misunderstandings that led to civilian casualties. Sarah realized they were offering her a way to survive, while compromising her mission in a way that might seem reasonable to her superiors. It was a sophisticated trap that would allow them to claim they had turned a Navy SEAL while giving her a plausible story about why she had cooperated. What makes you think I would accept that deal after refusing to cooperate for 3 days? Sarah asked. Dr. Rodriguez answered. Because you're not just a soldier, you're a survivor. You've proven you can endure anything, but you've also proven you can think strategically about long-term consequences. Dead heroes don't protect anyone. It was a logical argument, and Sarah could see how it might appeal to someone in her situation. But it was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of her character. They thought she had been protecting information when she had actually been protecting something more basic, her sense of who she was. Sarah Martinez had been the girl who stood up to bullies, who rescued cats from drainage pipes, who never backed down from a challenge. She had become a woman who volunteered for the most difficult training in the world and succeeded where others failed. She had built her entire identity around being someone who could endure anything without breaking. Accepting their deal wouldn't just mean providing intelligence to the enemy. It would mean admitting that she could be bought, that her resistance had a price, that she wasn't really the person she thought she was. That was a form of defeat she couldn't accept, regardless of the practical consequences. No deal, Sarah said simply. Elena stared at her for a long moment. You understand what that means? I understand, Sarah replied. Dr. Rodriguez shook her head. This is fascinating from a psychological perspective, but it's completely irrational from a survival standpoint. You're choosing death over a compromise that would allow you to continue serving your country. I'm choosing to be who I am, Sarah said. That's not irrational. That's the most rational thing I can do. The tall man gestured to the guards, who moved towards Sarah's chair. But before they could reach her, the lights in the building went out, and the sound of automatic weapons fire echoed through the corridors. Elena cursed in Spanish and drew a sidearm. Security breach. Get her ready to move. But the guards were already moving toward the door to assess the threat. The sounds of combat were getting closer, and Sarah could hear coordinated tactical movement that suggested professional military forces rather than random attackers. Elena grabbed Dr. Rodriguez and headed for the door. We're evacuating. Eliminate the prisoner, and let's go. The tall man raised his weapon towards Sarah, but she was already moving. 72 hours of careful observation had taught her exactly how the restraint system worked. During the questioning sessions, her captors had periodically loosened her bonds to prevent permanent circulation damage. Sarah had used those opportunities to study the restraints and plan for exactly this scenario. She twisted her wrists in a specific way that caused the zip ties to catch on the chair's metal framework. The plastic restraints were strong, but they weren't designed to withstand the kind of leverage she could generate by using the chair itself as a fulcrum. The ties snapped just as the tall man fired. Sarah threw herself sideways, taking the chair with her as she hit the floor. The bullet passed through the space where her head had been a moment before. She rolled behind the overturned chair and worked frantically to free her feet from the shackles. The tall man was advancing to finish the job when the door exploded inward, and smoke grenades filled the room. Sarah heard the distinctive sound of suppressed weapons and tactical commands being given in English. Her rescue team had found her. The firefight lasted less than 30 seconds. When the smoke cleared, Sarah was sitting against the wall, still partially restrained but alive. A figure in black tactical gear approached her, and she recognized the voice of her team leader, Lieutenant Commander James Morrison. About time you showed up, Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady despite the overwhelming relief she felt. Morrison cut through her remaining restraints and helped her to her feet. We've been tracking you for 48 hours. Had to wait for the right opportunity to extract you safely. As they moved through the building toward the extraction point, Sarah saw bodies in the corridors, some Liberation Front guards, but also Elena and Dr. Rodriguez. The tall man was nowhere to be seen, suggesting he had either escaped or been eliminated in another part of the building. Intel value. Morrison asked as they reached the exit. Sarah understood the question. He wanted to know if she had compromised any operational information during her captivity. 0, she replied. They got nothing. Morrison nodded approvingly. 72 hours of interrogation with no intel loss. That's going to make for an interesting debrief. As they boarded the extraction helicopter, Sarah looked back at the building where she had spent the last 3 days. She felt no satisfaction about the deaths of Elena and Dr. Rodriguez. They had been enemies, but they they had also been people with their own motivations and beliefs. The world was more complicated than the simple categories of good and evil that military training often assumed. But she also felt something else, a deep sense of completion. She had been tested in ways that most people would never experience, and she had not broken. She had protected her mission, her teammates, and, most importantly, her sense of who she was. Elena had been right about one thing. Sarah Martinez was exactly what she claimed to be. The helicopter lifted off into the dawn sky, carrying her away from the gray room and back toward whatever came next. Sarah closed her eyes and allowed herself to feel the exhaustion that she had been suppressing for 3 days. Her body hurt in ways that would take weeks to heal, but her mind was clear and her spirit was intact. She had survived 72 hours of systematic torture without breaking. More than that, she had discovered something about herself that no amount of training could have taught her. She was stronger than she had known, not because of her physical toughness or her mental conditioning, but because of something fundamental about who she chose to be in the world. As the helicopter flew toward the extraction point, Sarah Martinez allowed herself a small smile. Elena and Dr. Rodriguez had learned something valuable about Navy SEAL training, but they had missed the most important lesson. Some people can't be broken not because of their training, but because of their character. And character, once forged, is the strongest thing in the world. The mission was over. Sarah had completed it not by gathering intelligence or eliminating enemies, but by refusing to surrender the one thing that truly belonged to her, herself. In a world where everything could be taken away, where torture could destroy bodies and minds, that refusal was its own form of victory. She had proven, to herself and to anyone who cared to learn the lesson, that Navy SEALs don't break. Not because they can't, but because they choose not to. And sometimes, that choice is the most powerful weapon of all. A bombing that killed 43 people, including 15 children. The explosives came from a weapons cache that we believe your government located using intelligence you provided about our supply networks. Sarah stared at the images, her stomach turning. If this was real, if her intelligence had been used to disrupt Liberation Front operations that led to civilian casualties, then she might be indirectly responsible for those deaths. Of course, Dr. Rodriguez continued, we can't be certain your information was used in this operation. Government intelligence agencies have many sources. But the timing is suggestive, don't you think? Sarah realized what was happening. This was psychological warfare designed to make her question her own mission and motivations. The photographs might be real, but the connection to her intelligence was probably fabricated. The Liberation Front was trying to make her feel responsible for civilian deaths in order to break her will to resist. But knowing it was manipulation didn't make it less effective. The images of dead children would stay with her, along with the terrible possibility that her actions might have contributed to their deaths. Even if the connection was false, the doubt would eat at her resolve. We're not asking you to betray your country, Dr. Rodriguez said. We're asking you to help us prevent more tragedies like this one. Tell us what operations your government is planning. Help us protect innocent people who will be caught in the crossfire. It was a skillful appeal that combined guilt, moral responsibility, and the suggestion that cooperation would actually serve a higher good. Sarah could see why Dr. Rodriguez was effective at breaking people. She wasn't using crude torture or obvious threats. She was attacking the psychological foundations that allowed people to resist in the first place. Sarah looked directly at Dr. Rodriguez. Even if what you're saying is true, she said, giving you operational intelligence would put more lives at risk, not fewer. I won't help you hurt people, no matter what story you tell me about your motivations. Dr. Rodriguez smiled slightly, as if Sarah had confirmed something she had suspected. Interesting, she said. You're not even considering the possibility that we might be telling the truth about our humanitarian objectives. That suggests a level of psychological conditioning that goes beyond normal military training. She made notes on her tablet. Elena was right about you. You're not going to break under conventional pressure. But everyone breaks eventually, Sarah. Everyone. We just have to find the right approach. Impossible position. She could probably take Elena and one of the guards, but not both, not from this position, not without knowing how many others were in the building. More importantly, She realized that Elena was right. She had been naive. She had allowed her respect for Elena and the Liberation Front's humanitarian work to cloud her judgment about their capabilities as an intelligence organization. "What do you want?" Sarah asked, keeping her voice steady. Elena stepped into the room, and Sarah could see genuine sadness in her eyes. "We want to know everything you've learned about us. We want to know who you've reported to and what your government is planning. And we want to know why someone we thought we could trust turned out to be just another spy." "I was doing my job," Sarah said, "just like you're doing yours." "Maybe," Elena replied. "But now you're going to help us do our job a little better. You're going to tell us everything we want to know, and you're going to do it honestly. Because the alternative is something none of us want to think about." Sarah felt the cold metal of handcuffs closing around her wrists and knew that everything she had trained for, everything she had prepared for, was about to be tested in ways she had never imagined. As they led her from the building, she caught Elena's eye one more time. "I never lied about caring about your work," Sarah said quietly. Elena paused for a moment, and something flickered across her face. "I know," she replied. "That's what makes this so difficult.